I believe that we can begin now while we give some time for people to join. So first of all, thank you so much. I am Silvana Fumega. I am part of this team, Data Against Feminicide, along Elena, Catherine, and Isadora. And today we will be holding a new session, a new conversation. I'm sorry, there are some voices. If you can please mute your microphones. Thank you so much. Okay. As we do every November, we've been doing this for the past 4 years. This is a new event of Data Against Feminicide, and we are really happy to see all these people joining us, joining our talks and our events. As usual, we have the support of Data plus Feminicide Love, Feminicidio Uruguay, and ILDA. And today we're going to have a conversation about strategic datafication. I won't delve into much detail because I'm going to let the main characters, the main stars today to do that. We have a line of speakers that are going to share their different views, and they will surely be very enriching. Some practical things first before we go straight into the talk. Catherine, I don't know if we can change the slide so everyone can see. We will have interpretation, Spanish, English, and Portuguese. So please follow the instructions on screen. If you click on the globe, on the icon below, you can choose the language that you would prefer. We are going to have speakers in Portuguese and in Spanish. So then you can choose your preferred channel. And once again, we want to thank all the teams and all the people who are parts of Data Against Feminicide. I'm sorry, these things happen only when you're on Zoom. Somebody is ringing the bell quite loud. So now I'm going to call Lisa to continue with the introduction, and I'm terribly sorry. Thank you. Oh. Well, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Isadora Krushan. I am part of the team of Data Against Feminicide. I'm going to speak very briefly. Catherine, if you can please change to the next slide. First of all, I would like to present our team. There are several collaborators in this team of Data Against Feminicide. This is a collective project, and with great love and care, we are here, and we're very happy to be here together to join this conversation, to make it a bit broader. And the next slide before we move on to the questions. We will go back to this report later, but I just wanted to share that we have just published a report from a research that gathers some of the contributions that our team has made in the past 3 years, including the development of tools that help us monitor feminicide events. And Silvana, one of our presenters today, she's one of the collaborators. She collaborated in the design of these tools in Brazil and in Portuguese. And now, thank you, Catherine and Silvana. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Catherine de Ignacio. I'm an MIT professor and a director of the Data plus Feminism Lab at MIT. I am really happy to see all these names of the people joining us today, people from our community, people that we know now for the past 4 years, I believe. So it's a very good day for all of us. I just wanted to say at this point that our group, that what we're doing now is we're conducting this survey, and the survey is for groups or individuals that produce data on feminicide. We have interviewed many groups, but there are many more that we haven't, and we really want to hear about their experiences. So we are inviting you to complete this survey. We're going to add the link to the survey in the chat. And only one person from each group should complete the survey, just one per group. And later, next year, or perhaps next summer, we're going to share the results with this community, with you. We're trying to reach more groups globally, worldwide. So we're trying to contact groups, for example, in Asia, in Australia, in Europe, some groups that we haven't been in touch until now. So thank you so much for sharing the survey too among your groups and your connections. Oh, and one other thing, another thing that I wanted to say, if you check the option that you want to appear in our directory, we're going to publish a list of all the groups producing data on feminicide globally. But that's only if you want to appear, to participate. Just let us know. Okay. So one other thing I wanted to say is that we have two people here who have worked really hard in this survey. We have Patricia and Olivia Fiol. They're going to be here moderating, helping us with the chat. They are students at the lab, Data plus Feminism lab, and they're going to be helping us today. You're going to be in contact with them. So thank you, Patty and Olivia. And now I'm going to give the floor to Marielle. She's going to be the moderator for this conversation. Thank you, Marielle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this so important event for the celebration of this. We have it has been a long way, and we have worked a lot on against feminicide. We are accompanied today by people that have worked a lot in our community. They really have a long and important trajectory in this strategic data collection. Unfortunately, Anita Lucchesi won't be with us today. She works in Sovereign Bodies Institute in United States and Canada. She was one of the presenters today. But yes, we are accompanied today with Lisbeth Hernandez Cruz, and she's from the National Coordinations of Indigenous Women, CONAMI in Mexico. Silvana Mariano as well, from NEAS, the Observatory of Feminicides in Londrinas in Brazil. Then we have Elena Suarez Val. She's the co-founder of this project of Data Against Feminicide and Feminicide in Uruguay. Also, Alejandra Valdez Barrientos from the Observatory of Gender Equality in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we are very thankful to them for joining us in this conversation on strategic data. This will be carried out. I will ask 3 questions to each of them, and they have, I will give you the time that you have to answer, and then we have a series of questions, and we will open the sessions to questions and answers for all of us joining us today in this event, so we can have a collective way of thinking on strategic data. So I would like to ask the first question. Sorry for the interruption. We can ask Sophia Donner how is she going to carry out the session. Yes, thank you for reminding this about Sophia. Sophia, something very short, brief. We are going to have a session about the things, a graphic account of what you are going to do today. Just to let you know that. We are very lucky to have this help. An applause, a round of applause for her, please. So, with further ado, let's begin our conversation. Our first question for all of you is, if you can tell us a little bit about your organizations and what motivates you with this work with data. Please, can we begin by Elizabeth? Thank you very much to all of you. I participate in the National Coordination of Indigenous Coordination in Mexico. It's a network of organizations in Mexico from 1997. And one of the works that we do there has an initiative that we began in 2003, Community Emergency on Gender, and has all the documentation and evidence on it. Began the first motivation in 2013 was to have an account of the homicides, feminicides in Mexico. There was the environment where there was a lot of conversation about a public policy that which has been being worked in order to attend emergencies, but there was nothing mentioned about indigenous women. Those aspects were not included in the conversation. That was the first motivation, to make it visible, to make people aware about this specific aspect of feminicides. The gender emergency community, it's on digital activism on Facebook, for example, and we can share notes, articles related to different cases of violence against women. After several years, we just work on feminicide and all the evidence there. It's not against the feminicide itself, only that, but there are many other things that happened before that. And we also realized that we cannot separate violence against women and violence against our peoples. We cannot separate that. So we started to document all that violence against our peoples, like these forced movements that they have to do to different places. So that was one motivation in the beginning, but this motivation has been growing a lot. This is more or less it.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. And now let's move on to Silvana Mariano. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I am here. He wants to know if he can speak too. No, you can only listen. Okay. I just want to congratulate you and to thank you for this opportunity, for all this work that you've developed through these years. I am part of a group, a collective in Brazil, in Londrina, Paraná, that is called NEAS. It's a feminicide observatory in Londrina. And we began to get together after the experience of feminist activism and a campaign that we called Justice for Neas, which was my younger sister. She was a feminicide victim. She survived for 2 years and 2 months, but finally passed away 4 months after the trial and the conviction of her murderer. At that time, our main motivation to create Neas was that we found ourselves with how invisible this was in the media. The trial in court itself, and also the results of that trial with regard to feminicide cases. So we set out to create some kind of action, social action, that would involve the entire justice system and access to justice. And our work consists mainly on evaluating and assessing the response of the justice system in cases of feminicide. And our sources are, of course, the files or the case files of feminicides and attempted feminicides. So we are always in touch with other observatories, other organizations. We attend the trials to courts in Londrinas, and we also analyze the sentences, the convictions, At the moment, we're getting towards the end of one trial here in Londrina after a week in which we had 3 different attempted feminicide trials. So thank you. Thank you, Silvana. We also asked the same, Elena, the same question.
Hello, Helena, you're muted. Sorry. Okay. First of all, I wanted to say that it's a pleasure to be sharing this space with other women, all of us using data as a way of activism in order to put an end to violence against women in all its way of expressions and kinds. I believe that the motivation to believe the data collection where the anger and frustration in terms of the lack of response for the Uruguayan government in 2015, when I started all this, and also due to the mediation, the media communication of the cases, how they re-victimized the women and the expressions with violence and discrimination against women in the cases of feminicide, how the cases were informed by the media, and the social silence as well, because it was not a topic that was being spoken out loud in the society. At that time, I was part of a group that was formed in 2014, 2015, the coordinator of feminisms of Uruguay, and started to go out to the streets to protest in every time there was a feminicide. At that time was to mark out the role of the medias, how our voices made strengthened and pointed out and tried to change how the feminicides were broadcasted. In Uruguay at that time, we didn't have the feminicide as a type of crime in the law. That came later on. But I think that fostered by this activism in the streets, that in the general society found with this huge group of women, that when there was a feminicide, they went out to the streets and it was empowered. And from one less, not even one less in 2016, like supported in this other Latin American movement that was kind of protesting against this specific way of violence. And we know that it's based on broader violences. To have data on feminicide, for me, was a collective activity, collective. It began as a strategy to recall our activism, because what I continue from that moment began as a record of the cases in which we had protested. It was a double record of those women and that activism as well. And for me, that has been a very important part in all records, data collected, that I have come across, and we have come across along these projects on feminicide, that are really the way of real activism. Data on feminicide is not disconnected from our point of view, from our emotions, our needs, and eagerness to change everything. They need to be strategic. How we apply a tool like data that in a way is even more and more visible or in fashion, so to say. We can think not what happened during the pandemic, how data was something that prevailed everywhere in the pages of all newspapers. Activisms, we know that data is a language that we can use strategically to talk to the systems, to talk to the governments, to those who sometimes want to talk from the reason, but not from the emotions. I think it's very important that data against feminicide that we collect, they're always linked to memory, to the emotions, and empiric data as a way of activism.
Thank you so much, Elena. And finally, we asked Alejandra, same question. Hello. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be here today. I think this is a very nice space for dialogue at a time where we remember many women who did not survive gender-based violence, and millions of those who are experiencing it in their daily lives. I work at the Economic Commission for Latin America, and for a long time, since 2009, we've been responsible of the regional indicator of feminicide published by our organization every year, or the observatory, that is a mandate of the Regional Conference on Women. It was following an agreement in 2007 to gather feminicide data with this tool. And therefore, since 2009, we began to collect information about the deaths of women to the hands of their partners or ex-partners, because at the time, the authorities, the Women's Institute, didn't want it to be called feminicide, because only in 3 countries in the region we had legislation in that regard, and therefore they didn't have many internal tools, legal tools, to gather that information under that name. And also because the conceptual debate had not yet been installed in society as it is right now, and also at a political level, it was not as present as today. And without a doubt, it was the most feminist authorities, the ones who drew the line, who set this limit, and this difficulty to operate within the states. But while I am stubborn, so what I did was, apart from gathering this data, we started to demand countries for their data on feminicide or violent deaths of women. And that was included gender-based reasons, ranging from the finding of the bodies of the corpses, also the forensic process, and sometimes also with the data to open the cases, legal cases or police files. And so in that regard, we were able to gather data and build series. This was a very, we didn't have many resources, but later, after 2009, for some countries such as Costa Rica, we were able to gather series ranging from 2004 onwards. So we make this application. We ask these countries in the region, and countries take about 2 or 3 months to return information that has to do with how they bring data together, how they analyze them in different institutions. In general, in most countries, there is participation of the police, district attorneys, sometimes the courts, the different ministries like women's offices or commissions, but that's mainly between 7 or 9 institutions. And in some cases, the leadership is some statistic institutes from different countries, which are responsible at the moment to support the methodology for these different teams to produce information insofar as we get it. For the past 4 or 5 years, we managed to make this indicator something to complement the different goals of sustainable goals, global indicators, for example, having addresses separated by sex. And in that context, we have our proposal from the ECLAC was to have one unique record with different categories and variables to analyze, to make it more complex, the way we analyze this year on year with gender perspective and also intersectional perspective to see the different inequalities. And on the other hand, this comes together with the work that we have been doing with the UN Women to work on the statistical data of feminicide. So it's not the only thing we do in violence, but when it comes to feminicide, that is what we have been working on. And clearly, as a feminist activist, I have been working, wow, it's been long, since 1988 with violence. Well, the entire issue of violence.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and thank you all of you for this brief about this first round when we are talking about motivations of all of us to work with data. We include topics like gender violence as one more step of violence against indigenous and original communities. We also talked about judicial data, a vision of the justice in cases of feminicides, in our cases, like in the case of Brazil, and the history of feminist activism groups, like in the case of Uruguay, and genealogy since 1988 for feminist, how to deal with feminicide cases. Now we can continue on with the topic of today, strategic use of data. So from your experience, how have you done all the strategic approach on this and the limitations that you see on this work? 5 minutes per person to answer this question. And I would like to begin the other way around, first with Alejandra from CEPAL. In terms of strategic terms, as I already told you, the beginning of the institution is from where we build this data. It is done within the context of the regional conference. It has to do with the mechanisms for dealing with women, and on the other side, the Statistics Commission of the Americas. So these are two strategic environments where we have been working to strengthen this data, not only from the CEPAL, the ECLAC, but also from other institutions, the Statistic Institute, the civil society, and the academy, mainly in the environments of debates on violence and statistics and violence against women, for conversations with statistic institutions and organizations. It's a conversation that is very strategic in order to see which is the data to be used, data collected by administrative organizations from the justice. We use data also from researches carried out by Mexico, mainly by Echari and Perlove, and data on feminicide, estimations on feminicides that can be projected from the analysis of death certificates. That's the debate, the strategic debate from which we can begin this conversation, and then at present we can work on a strategic use related to the strengthening of skills in the public servants, or those who make decisions, that they support us in the teaching. We have several courses, and during all these years, we have done technical support to different institutions on data and good quality data on feminicide, and building the unique records on feminicides and different cases of violence in several countries in the region. I think that from the strategic point of view, this is a data that is very important from the technical point of view. It's a mega data. So it's a very political data that has enabled us to go along other women organizations, civil society, the survivors, and to go along hand in hand with women lawmakers, legislators, congresswomen, to strengthen certain laws. Several countries have their comprehensive laws. And on the other hand, all countries in Latin America have laws regarding feminicide and have worked on the laws on the generation and collection of data. And I think there is a strategic work that many actors have been carrying out, not only from our scope, but from different other scopes.
Thank you, Alejandra. Elena. Considering the uses and limitations, in Uruguay, data have been, it's been, as I said before, it also reflects activism in Uruguay. And in 2016 or 17, finally, Congress, Parliament passed two laws that refer to feminicide. One is a comprehensive law, one that Alejandra mentioned, to guarantee life free of violence based on gender for women. And the other one was including in the criminal code the specifics of femicide. And on that note, at that point, there was data played a key role there, as Alejandra said, as a political element, as an element that would support, sustain activism and the debate and conversations, whether women in politics or feminists in the political arena. Sometimes I wonder what happens now. One of the most useful things about data is how they serve to produce knowledge. When there's something that we don't know, one way of knowing that is to produce data about that. Well, in this case, we are talking about the characteristics of the different cases or the geographic distribution of where it happens, or the evolution in time, or it could be, again, the trials and the results, the outcomes of those trials, so on and so forth. So there is this function of data, which is to produce, to categorize, to put in order our knowledge about something. But now sometimes I wonder, this is the next question, right? How much more data do we need once that we already have knowledge about the existence of feminicide as part of a continuum of violence based on gender? And of course, that changes with time and in different places. But I feel that specifically in Uruguay, in the Uruguayan context, it is part of the social conversation. It is part of the legal conversation that there is a problem that's feminicide and that it has certain characteristics. Of course, there is still debate, and it is never it's not a full, unended conversation, but I do feel that there has been great progress in that debate and conversation. So I wonder now what kind of data might be necessary now to continue moving forward with that conversation. And I feel that perhaps we have reached a context where we need other tools. And in that regard, one of the strategic uses of data that I think is very productive, and that we discussed last year too in our last session of Data Against Feminicide, is what it's like when we are talking, when we talk within our team here in Data Against Feminicide, we call it artivism, data artivism, which has to do with blending activism, using art as a means of expression to interpret the data and to produce different ways of social intervention that might approach this social conversation from other places, from places more related to people feeling relating to something, feeling identified to something, feeling a closeness to those data for more people. So I think that we have to begin to think, to consider data as this potential, for other actions. Data activism could be one of them. And again, I want to mention as a final point, this other thing that I said at the beginning. One of the main approaches that we took when we started recording this data in Uruguay had been the way in which the media dealt with these cases. And I think that there is a lot to be done in that regard. The media is they are still the main source of data for activists, for us, keeping our unofficial records on feminicide. And so that's a major limitation, and it has to do with what kind of coverage the media make, which are the cases that they do gather, which ones they ignore, what kind of data they include in their coverages. For example, Lisbeth, I'm sure she will be able to emphasize this in greater detail, but sometimes cases involving women in different contexts like poverty, indigenous groups, racialized women, these cases do not get as much airtime. They are not considered as relevant by the media, by the press. They're disregarded in their coverages, and that, of course, sometimes can result in, and of course, a less production of data regarding those cases, which is why I think that it would be important to analyze how we can use data strategically also to work with the media, to be able to reinforce their coverages, and to also remember that the media are very important in transmitting our culture, which ultimately I think is something that we need to aim at, the internal, the domestic, cultural, and social changes that can also be reinforced through the law. But the legal thing is not enough. It doesn't get to change the hearts or the minds of people. Yes, I think I'm going to stop there at that.
Thank you, Elena. Now, talking about artivism, please remember that Sophia Dorner is making a graphic account of this conversation, and she's going to share that at the end. Now, the same question to Silvana de Meyers. For us, the most important strategic in NEAS, the cases that go to court, is to bring light to how the legal system deals to the victims along the process, and as well as in the court hearings. I think they have a technical problem. So the re-victimization is one of the most important focus in the NEA's work. And it was in the beginning of our work, and in our analysis, it was part of the work we did. In each case that goes to court and before the jury, and our concern with re-victimization, we also develop analysis of which are the gender bias that are part of the legal system and how they work. And this gender bias can result into one or another kind of sentence. For example, the relationship between the re-victimization of women and how the sentence is reduced. Sometimes we find that in the results of the hearings of the suits, the data from NEARS have been very important to identify, based on evidence, and identify the obstacles that we have in Brazil to the real application of law against feminicide. Brazil, feminicide is a qualification, una qualification. In cases of homicides, it's qualified as a crime, and there are several types. When the feminicide happens within the constants within family violence and home violence, and something different, it's when it's related to the woman because of gender, and that's how the wording of our law has been, and how we follow it up helps us to identify the different kinds within the law. For example, paragraph 2 to recognize paragraph 2 recognize feminicide as a result of undermining women. It's not considered a crime. So we have moved our data in order to case a debate on the importance of the application of paragraph 2 to recognize feminicides beyond the violence within the context of home violence and family violence in the case of Brazil, because it's included in the Maria da Penha law. For some law operators from the police and the legal system, Maria da Penha law has been a limitation for the visualization of cases, feminicide cases. So we have used our data, we have used them strategically to make a protest and claim about this, because the paragraph 2 of the law must be applied, enforced, and it's even bigger, more important. There is more undermining in these crimes that are also feminicide, even though the police and the legal system do not acknowledge this as feminicide. We follow up these cases that are formally denounced as feminicide, and those that are not denounced, claimed as feminicide. We understand they should be considered in the legal system as feminicides within the protocol of UN Women and other enforced protocols enforced in Brazil, whether they belong to the Brazilian states or international level, and that the authorities have not recognized. One limitation that we have is the fact that NAYERS is an organization that can act within its community at local level. So our scope is limited, and our intent is to create a political and community awareness so that the organizations themselves that belong to the state can undertake for themselves the task, the activity of collecting and producing data, taking into account the responses from the state on feminicide cases. So through data created by the organizations themselves in the states, we would have data at national level, especially taking into account the scope of Brazil, the size of Brazil. So a limitation of NAYERS data is the scale. We are very limited to our community. Thank you,
Silvana. And finally, we're going to hear Lisbeth, and I have a special request if we can speak a bit more slowly so the interpreters have an easier work. I think it's my turn, right? Okay. Well, I think that I agree with what we've been sharing, these women that spoke before me, with this idea that you produce data to have a dialogue, in this case with the state, but also with international organizations in the production of reports, all these different mechanisms that institutions have. And in some way, we also seek to say something play some part. I would like to share something in the Mexican context. I think that this is also the case in other countries, but here there's like this thing that's also been called the dance of figures. How many feminicides you have, and it is a very complex thing. The National Observatory of Feminicide talks about uh, very high figures of feminicides every day, but it depends on every state, because here the country is divided in states, and each state has its own criminal code, and it uses its own criminal code. And so that can become complex. Accountability can be complex. Counting how many feminicides are there, that will depend. It depends if you take the investigation folders. It depends if you take death certificates as a source. So it's really complex. But apart from this complexity, and hence our insistence is that they are not disaggregated for ethical conditions. It doesn't happen in the investigation folders. It doesn't happen in the death certificates either. So to us, this has also implied this dialogue with the state. It has also involved dialogue with the feminist movement in that regard. CONAMI is not a feminist organization. So for us, it has also represented like this a specific thing. As indigenous women, we also have this need that we have to consider. So that was also another place to analyze it, and that is why it came to be in a way. And also another thing that we've considered, I was precisely thinking about this context of figures and this dance of figures. We do have some accountability, but we have focused much more on thinking about the process, the way we record, the way we document, why we're gathering, why are we doing this? Does it make sense to us? Okay, and if so, how? To keep record of these different forms of violence. And that has led us to different reflections, to some meetings, some important, significant gatherings that have led us to think that it's not just cases. These were sisters, or mothers, women who struggled with us, people. And that leads us to reflect upon making data more human, because of course, keeping count, well, we've seen it. It's very important. It's very strategic. It's necessary. And of course, we have to do it too. But why? Why are we keeping record of that? And the truth is that in these past few years, we have tended a bit more towards that side, which is where we are trying to stand now. This constant question of why are we keeping record of this? We have even, as we have also made this reflection, we are undergoing this process. We are generating this knowledge because it's necessary, because we have to make it visible. But this reflection has led us to think that generation of knowledge is also useful. This understanding is also a way to heal, to try to understand. And although it is very hard and very painful to record these cases, but at the same time, you feel that you are doing something. I mean, that is the work that we do from activism, precisely to try and have some influence in some way. And in that regard, we also think that the limitations that we have that offered by this quantification of data, of counting, I think that we should ask ourselves what these trends conceal, what is underlying that. Because, data in Mexico, for instance, in the last survey, the home survey, that it includes violence, it can tell us that there is less physical violence. Okay, but what has increased? I mean, for example, we know there's this area in Mexico, this indigenous area, physical violence has reduced, but psychological violence has increased. And how do you account for how do you record psychological violence? How do you count it? Of course, it exists and it's really valuable. And of course, we know and we have seen that having data is much better than not having data. But we need to make this data more complex. The analysis has to be more complex. So we've been working towards that. And precisely that is what we are saying. We believe that this counting can reduce the thing to cases, 1, 2, 3, 4 cases. But what about the process? The process is what happened in that context that led to that kind of violence to take place. And to us, it is very important to consider the context. I was saying that earlier. Gender-based violence is one extra violence against our peoples, but it's not just that. It's a combination. They are blended together. So the context is very important. For example, let's consider a concept of forced displacement, which is happening in many places. For example, in Chiapas, forced displacement or involving crime, for instance, organized crime, which forces indigenous communities to leave their territories. And in that context of violence against our peoples, while at the same time violence against women increases or gets more brutal. So we believe that contexts are that we necessarily have to consider them. And when we just count the cases, the context can be omitted. The processes are not do not appear there. For example, when we record emergency in gender-based violence very recently, we are also including georeferences. So in a way, we are gradually showing where these cases are happening. And we can see that in some cases, we find that when at the same time we have a process of defense of the territory where indigenous and native peoples are defending their territories, we also see an increase of more brutal violence against women and feminicide. And that is very important as well, because you can count one feminicide, and if you just consider it as a feminicide, well, perhaps you admit that she could also be a woman defending her territory. So precisely the system, the state, it would be better for them to say it was just a feminicide, it was just her partner. But they are not saying, they are omitting that she was defending territory against, for example, a mining company. So we have taken a turn towards this, towards trying to understand the context. And in that regard, another thing that is very important for us is to keep things together, to not analyze them in isolation, not keeping them separate. For example, I could tell you, up until now, as Konami, we are a grassroots organization. We all work here because we are interested in it. We are activists. We are interested in doing this work. But up until now, we haven't produced a report with data as such. We share in spaces like this. We have projects with academic organizations, and one in Canada. And what we do is we talk about these processes, how we gather how we document what we can say, what we can't. At this moment, for example, I couldn't tell you we have 50 feminists because that is not what we have been focusing on. And we haven't been able to produce that kind of information also because we also have these limitations to follow these systematic processes to gather all the data that we produce. We have limitations because we all make our living doing something different. Nobody works specifically on this. We are doing this in some time that we can find, and we always work on projects, but we all do other things apart from our work, our local work, so to speak, in our communities. So we haven't devoted to that in full, but we can share these reflections that we have shared within our group. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisbeth. I think that Alejandra wants to share something. I have 1 more minute for this question. Yes. Thank you, Lisbeth, for your contribution in the context, because clearly it's one of the important things. We cannot just count, just only do that, as if this was just something resources. I think that data first, to build data, is not only that. Data construction helps us to have questions or understand the context. So along these years that I have been working in this official observatory, in each country, this observatory has to do with the social society and enabled us to know who are the victims that are not included in the official data because they were killed in the client's house or somewhere else in the national legislation. Sexual workers are not included in the feminicide victims. And because the judge didn't consider that and just considered it as a homicide with other characteristics and so on. So I think that there is the context, if they are really help us to have clarity on the subject. So this defense is a huge topic, has to do with political autonomy, the fight for autonomy, political for the sector's autonomy, and economic autonomy of the peoples. And I think there's a lot to be done. I really think that besides the feminicide reading, it has a biased approach. I think that we have to move forward on that. The countries do not provide disaggregated data. I think that we have 7, 8 countries that provide data disaggregated by nationality, for example, and that will enable us to have a more thorough and complex analysis. There is still a lot to be done. So I wanted to mention about data is useful in order to prevent and to create new answers. To prevent, because they enable us to know the claim root in the different cases of violence and the feminicide, to know the impunity of the state in its different views, and they don't comply with due diligence of international standards that we feminist activists know, not only the international organizations. When we talk about what we achieve about in institutions, it's done because of the feminist activists. It's otherwise there wouldn't be anything. And that's what finds the leak in the system and all the readings. I also think that there is a great improvement with data, but we are also moving backwards because there are certain doubts. What can we do with the data? And we have to know, to be there, how to deal with that and to be in the systems. The activists that are committed with that in rural areas and indigenous groups in the countryside, the observatory has helped to the counting. There's a lot to be a record. There are many contexts, personal features that are not included in the record, in violence in general and feminicide in particular. I think the intersectional approach, not only in African women, but in general terms in the diversity, is still to be a lot to be done. But to prevent, because data help us to make this prevention system, warning systems in the 18 countries in the region. In the Caribbean, just there you have 9. There are warning systems, and they are very basic. And in some cases, because of the lack of budget, they're not good implemented. In some cases, some women have managed to achieve some things. But on the other side, in order to make repairs in the case of victims, the survivors, mainly with children or with people that depend on them, of these feminicide victims, I think these are the 2 main big packages that can be produced with data, with prevention and repair, regardless of the follow-up and attention to that. I think that the men, I go along the processes. I don't do a judicial follow-up because my approach is on the prevention, in order to create a prevention system so that the prosecutors and the police forces can know that 2 or 3 claims that are repeated in the health provider, in the police station, there is a unique system that has been interoperated that can bring us a light on certain women, because there are 2 claims related to her. You have to send a police officer, you have to send a social worker to and accompany those cases, and sometimes take the women away from that environment. And that is also a requirement that is very weak in political policy that should be available to all of them. That's what I wanted to add to my participation. The strategic usage of data in terms of the public policies to produce data, to collect data, to broadcast data, is to strengthen the response from the public and private sectors. There should be private clinics or other responses, but data, just to have all this data, helps us to know what we need and how to respond with the due diligence that is approved in the international conventions.
Thank you, Alejandra, for anticipating and fully responding our final question, which I am also going to ask the other women, which is why to build data, or in other words, how much data do we need to take action, and how much do we need that data to take action? And I would like to begin with Silvana from NEAS. Unfortunately, in Brazil, there is great scarcity of data. There are data that do not match the criteria, the quantification criteria. There are many challenges. Somebody just mentioned, one of the women said, even to measure how many feminicides happen on average in Brazil in a year, for example. We have a great workload that we have to do before as activists. We have to act to get the data, whether it is demanding the availability of those data in a condition that we can use it. That is not what happens in Brazil. There are very few institutions that produce data, and they just publish the aggregated data. So we have no access to the primary disaggregated data. So we have to say that data are built, or we need to demand that they are made available. And this is also gathering the experience of many organizations in Brazil. There are many women's organizations, and we need these new experiences to show how viable these data are, generating this data. So, for example, in NEAS, we allowed ourselves to enter a new territory. So to leave data available about the justice system, we tried to develop this so that it would become a form of mechanism of social control, to evaluate this answer. So we can see how is the law on feminicide implemented? What are the responses that we have? For example, when the process, when we finish the judicial stage, it is very challenging as an organization, a civil society organization, basically consisting of activists. That's all we have. We don't have a specialized team, specialized in detail and in data organization, but we've been doing continuous ongoing work, which is necessary to have a solid database, consistent and reliable. And this is what we try to do because we understand that there is power in data. The political dialogue, it's important too. When our position is goes beyond opinions, we don't issue opinions. If what leads us is data, the data that we gathered through evidence with methodology and an organization system and a record system, that gives us credibility, that gives us reliability. So we can follow these cases and give voice to these women. Many of these come anonymously. And we have contributed to increase visibility of that kind of violence, feminicide violence, and to help us talk more about it, about feminicide. This is a universe that is now more visible in the Brazilian context. Feminicide is including feminicides that just attempted feminicides that don't ultimately end in feminicide, but raising awareness about that. I really agree with what Alejandra was saying about this synthesis, about the importance of data for prevention and to generate new and better responses. That is along the same lines of what we are promoting through NEAS, and we hope that it would be useful for other institutions, for other organizations in the future. Thank you very much.
Now, the same question for Lisbeth. Yes, thank you. Well, we have thought about this, like depending from who takes the measures. So from CONAMI, our work is in the community emergency based on gender violence, how to strengthen the organizations that are working on prevention of violence in their own communities. We are working from different places, local community, the state, national levels. We are part of international level organizations, and we have to understand that we have different spaces, and in each of them, there is a different way of working. So for us, for example, we know that data are necessary, and we know that in some cases do not make it to the front page of the newspapers. Nobody knows, but for those of us who work in the community level, we know about them. So we have been trying to have a file with data collection so that local organizations can document that. That's one measure that for us as an organization, we consider it is important. At the dialogue level with the state, with the government, well, it's quite difficult. It's a question that how many data you need is more or less what we try to do is with what we have, with our reflections, our thoughts, and when we have, we are trying to get into dialogue in order to include a intercultural approach that is stronger in the national legislation for violence in Mexico that hasn't been built yet. With that perspective, that's where we are seeking that we know that dialogues with the governments, they take a long time and complex, and you have to insist for a long time. So we can ask the question to the government, what else do you need to know in order to take the measures, specific and particular measures? So history has shown us that it doesn't matter how much how much we say. It's not that feminicide, at least in Mexico, was typified in 2012. So from that on, feminicide has been classified that women have been killed for a long time. So this is something that we We see that. And from there, we also think that the data that we are collecting, on one hand, help us to demand the government and other international organizations these mechanisms. But at the same time, for us, it's a place for proposals. Indigenous communities in Mexico, we are used to build our own ways, to build our own systems, what our peoples need. For example, data, we have also thought about them to use them for making awareness and sensitivity to the local authorities. That's what we already have. We don't have to talk about the percentages and numbers and figures. What we have is what we are using to do this work every day. So this is what we do. Something else that is very important as well is the work of these 10 years of community emergency has also helped us to take measures for ourselves. Because basically, all of us that participate here in this collection of data on different cases, to go to review the notes, the cases, something that we do quantify, even though a short time ago, I gave you some figures of the National Observatory of Women Killed in Mexico. When you say 11, someone may say it's not that much. Who are those 11 women? That's what we do to understand and make this data humanize them so that it hurts. All these processes hurt. For us, one of the measures that we took is what we do to take care of ourselves so that this work that we are carrying out does not hurt us more than is necessary. And we can go on doing the work that we're doing. Because if we are hurt, we cannot go on. They make it visible to share, to have dialogues with the governments, international organizations. This requires that we are fine, that we are well. And this requires us to have this approach, to be in good and good situation. I also agree that definitely we need data. Yes, we need them a lot. As Elena said a short while ago, that this knowledge also enables us to disarticulate what happens in each case, how the different cases have resemblances, how can we prevent all this. I think that Alejandra was saying that we also need this for prevention. We think that if we are able, that we manage, that the public policies really were based and with a contextual production and thought about context, would really help to make all these work out in prevention of violence. And it would not be something generalized. What happens, I don't know, what happens in Mexico City is more or less the same as anywhere else. No, generalizations are not good. Data collection helps us to have this idea that these specificalities, particularities are very necessary. Yes, generalities for the public policies is not my line of work, but they are different contexts. So I think that can go on producing data, perhaps we can move forward and push that idea. That could be a plan. And finally, in the end, I think just going along with what you said, with these meetings and these getting together, thinking about what we're doing, why gathering and collecting data, what can we do? I think these spaces are very useful. And this is the reason for this meeting, data and quantifying data. So I think it's very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth and Elena. And also, I would like to ask you if you have any questions, please include them in the chat window. Thank you. I think at this question of how much more data do we need and how much do we need. Data is something that I've been asking myself for a long time. And as everyone has mentioned in different ways, data help us dialogue. They provide a foundation for our arguments. When we are expected to have that, when that is demanded from us, when emotion is not considered something valid in a debate of this kind, there are many things running around my head now. But I think that more broadly speaking, I would say that perhaps it's a utopia, but it would be interesting to see how far can we keep pushing for this. I know that we have been doing it for some time now, to make sure that quantification is not the only possible or the privileged way to present an argument regarding a pressing issue. This, of course, faces with a paradox. How do we present data and speak the language of data, but at the same time continue insisting on the fact that we want to discuss context, lives, stories, dreams, the realities, and what we always say and what almost everyone, all the groups and people that we have been interviewing for the past 4 years, they are not figures, they are not numbers, they are women. So we are constantly living in this paradox where on one hand we talk about figures and on the other we don't want to talk about figures. That's the first thing. Perhaps it could be, as I said, a bit of a utopia, but we could think about possible ways, and we could devote our energies to change the conversation in such a way that data are not as necessary. Is a little bit of what Lisbeth said, also to show other ways, and she talked about the particulars. But other things that women have mentioned here and that have been very important for me as a process is the context. The kind of work that I do in Uruguay is individual, so my resources are very limited. It's just me. I'm not part of an organization at the moment. So, my record is very poor in that regard, because I just cannot delve deep into the different investigations of each of the cases and investigate, research their context. But I have been trying to learn to identify other things that are also necessary to know. And for example, that is the attempted feminicide. The attempts of feminicide, as Silvana mentioned, that is something that I have begun to include in the database, because I was feeling it in my body that I wasn't being clear, that the database wasn't clear in reflecting the full scope of feminicide and violence. And that opens the room for a space for another question. Is feminicide the only form of violence? Well, of course, no, we do know there are many others. But then what happens when we emphasize these cases? Well, perhaps it makes other forms of violence less visible, or it withdraws resources from other things that are also, in a way, part of this structural continuum of violence in which we live, and that leads to the ultimate feminicide. So then there's that question there, is there a way? What ways can we find to devoting other resources to visualizing the interactions between other forms of violence that are not feminicide, other forms of gender-based violence? And then we run into what you have been mentioning here, which is resources. How can you broaden your scope when you have scarce resources? And especially so for those of us working from the media monitoring, when we know that it's evident that not all forms of violence make it to the first page, make it to the headlines. Attempted feminicides many often don't appear anywhere. They have to be really brutal, spectacularly brutal to make it to the headlines. And another thing that I would like to bring here is men. What happens? What about the men? Many of us, most of us, all of us, we focus on women. And women are the center, the motivation of our memory, of our grief, of our mourning that we do through the data. But sometimes that makes other people who are really the main characters of the feminicide, less visible, and that is men who commit feminicide. Although I agree with Alejandra that I don't care about them, I do care insofar as I believe that it's important. I was going to say to begin, well, not begin, because continue. We continue finding ways to focus on other strategies because it's vital. Prevention is vital. Reparations are vital. But we are in a place where the potential for feminicide is there. If we have reparations, it means there was a feminicide, and prevention implies that there's a danger. So I wonder, is there a way, can we reach a point in which there is less danger of being in a situation of feminicide? What I mean is how to have less men who can be potential perpetrators of feminicide. How do we generate that structural change in the way that men relate to women, not just in their intimate relationships, of course? I don't know if that is the limit of data. I think, how can data, influence men? That would be a question to ask, to explore. And I want to say one other final thing, and it has to do with moving the conversation a bit away from the part of public policy or even actions that we can take as feminist organizations, and move it to a different territory that, the public in general, people in general, society in general. And I'm saying this, of course, it's vital that we do have public policies and that they are good and that they are well funded, because that's another thing that happens in Uruguay. We have a great law, but there are no resources to implement it. But what happens with daily life, for example? And in that regard, I want to bring something else to the table. These are results of my research for my PhD. I studied the presence and the role of data in the conversation about feminicide on social media, on Twitter, now X. And I found some interesting things there. And the first one is that data is not a significant part of that conversation. For example, from my analysis, for about eight months of Twitter conversations related to feminicide, 6% of tweets included some mention of some sort of data. For example, that was very significant to me to find out to learn that the conversation, less directed conversation, something that outside the political space or social organizations, that in those spaces data are not as significant. But studying that world, the world of that 6% of the conversation on Twitter that did involve data with regard to feminicide, I found that there were many emotions and many actions related, above all, to care. And and I remembered what Lisbeth was saying about self-care, but also how data operate in a way as a form of care, care for the memory of the women and of all of us, of the people. But I just wanted to throw those questions to the table for the next one.
Thank you, Elena. And thanks to all of you for this conversation, where we went along the trajectory and development in the institutions, laws and judicial system in activism and feminism and data against feminicide, criticisms on the limitations of the exercise and quantification to deal with this topic, and the directions that we can follow in order to put our heart in data collection within the context, as Elena said, and Alejandra said, and humanization, as Lisbeth said, and always thinking about justice for the women that are not with us any longer. I think I can see that the questions on the chat are also answered in the chat itself. So we can share data with the police or not. Now you will see two more questions for Lisbeth. They will share them on the chat. So now we can move forward with Sophia. Sophia, that she's been working all along the session. Hello, hello. Thank you so much. As usual, it happens with us that I've been working with you for the last 4 years. Everything is so interesting that it's hard for me to select and resume and then put it into paper. You will see this. Let's see what you think about this. These are the concepts that I considered most important, even though there are lots of things to be included. So you can have a few moments in silence for this. Now I can go on. If anyone wants to make a comment or a question. These slides reads from left to right on the part. Lisbeth Hernandez Cruz, objective to visualize feminicides against women. So Sophie goes on. As I said before, it was hard for me because everything seemed important to me. So the strategic uses is within the importance of the context. It really called my attentions, has to do with the questions about data, a different approach that can be crack or lead to new things, how to generate data, and the humanization. And this question of why do we record all this? I think it has to do with, comes later, about care and all the work and the warning out. People that have been working in this for years, of this warning out work emotionally. And then you have the humanization that I think is really important. And then data as a political tool to create state policies. There's always awareness and visibility appears them every year and in every step. That's a key element. With a question, how much data we need, I feel that when the girls told us about this, I felt that they are tired. How long are we going to continue with this? But I also think it's important what Lisbeth said about using the data we already have. What we have is valid, is good. And then transform what Elena said, to transform figures into the stories, into the people, and try to work on so that this is enough to achieve that something is done. I think these are the things that I recall that called my attention at the moment. I don't know if you have any comments, anything to add that you think it's important to be added in this work.
You,
They're
we are
speechless.
speechless now, Sophie. Thank you. Can I say something? Yes. Go ahead. I think that was Sophie saying, that we see it there with that shadow, without invalidating anything of what just said, this thing that it doesn't matter how much data we have if organizations don't respond. So now we know, because surveys in the region tell us that 1 in 3 women suffer some sort of violence, have suffered 60 or 70% in any, has experienced some form of violence in the countries that have national surveys. That's so when we add all that up, when you do the math and you see it's 1/3 of the population in Latin America, that's more than 110 million women who have experienced violence in their relationship during their lives, according to the surveys. So clearly, what is the strategy as a civil society, as a feminist organization, when we share with others this issue, this problem? What are all the strategies that we still need to employ? I think there are many, because it's a very brief period in history. It's a recent. Next year, we're going to have 30 years after Beijing on the 2025. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot that remains to be done. And when we talk about the states, we know that states try hard when there are some actors in the governments that have been elected to do that. But the problem is when those don't believe in gender-based violence and who say that we lie, who believe that we are, all this leads to the opposite of progress. You know, Silvana said it in a different way when she talked about that. All these, all the things that get lost, we lose, of course, data, but also lives. And it's like going back. It's like a regression. And it has to do with society. So I think that there's a lot to do in that regard. And if the states, the governments, and society doesn't hold them accountable. So when we think of 110 million, that's a lot. When we talk about 2/3, that's to 20 million, where we say 60% of women. So the amount, the massive condition of violence against women is a pandemic much larger than COVID or any other pandemic that kept us trapped at home. So there's a lot to do. And there's a lot to demand. And there are some who have made a commitment to do this, but there's a lot still to be done. Thank you so much, Alejandra, for this final reflection. And now, Catherine and Silvana, you have the floor. I'm going to be leaving you because, unfortunately, I apologize, but I have to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to you. Thanks to you. Thank you, Alejandra. I want to. Can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I want to invite all of you to unmute your microphones. Can you see me? Yes. I can see myself. Yes, now it's right. Your camera is on. Okay, I want to invite all of you to unmute so we can make a clap to all the panelists, presenters, Sophie, Patty, and Olivia. So unmute and let's join the clap. That's good. This conversation has been amazing. And thanks, because as you know, even to organize this meeting, there are lots of people walking the backstage behind the scene. So thanks to all of them participating in order that we can have this meeting today. Thanks to the presenters, so strong presentations for their work they're doing in the world. And thanks, Marielle, for being the moderator here. And don't forget that we have today the launch of the report mentioned by Lisa. Perhaps we can have the link in the chat and the survey as well for all the groups that are working on feminicide data. Please complete the survey so that we can get to know, have a better knowledge of the community that is working, inviting to all the work, the world groups to participate in this conversation. Thanks also to the interpreters that have been working a lot today, because this session today didn't have presentations, live conversations, and they have been doing the interpretation. Thanks to them as well. Am I forgetting anything, Silvana? I don't know what else.
No, I think that's all. We just want to remind you that both the recording and the material prepared by Sophia will be in our website in the next few days, along with the material that we have from our previous events and also the tools and different things that we've been working on. So we hope you can join us there. And again, thank you so much to everyone who made this possible and to all those who participated. And I hope we can see each other again soon, very soon. See you next time. Bye bye. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. See you next time. Thank you, Silvana. Bye.
Thanks. See you soon.